What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. When it comes to Ivern, he definitely is a champion that seems like he might have been just as nutty from the start of his design, but to be honest, he was actually a lot different when he was first proposed, so there's actually quite a lot of things that could have happened that would have actually made him turn out pretty differently in the end of the day. And we gotta give a big thanks to Riot for being super transparent with their development info as well. And today we're taking a look back before his release to find out just what Ivern could have been, showing off especially a focus on his abilities and concepts and just everything else. And if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button, because if this video hits, let's say 5,000 ratings, I'm gonna buy myself a nice pizza. So let's get started. So Ivern first started out with Riot's desire to make a druid type of character. If you think about it, quite a lot of fantasy archetypes have already kind of been covered in League of Legends so far, from mythical creatures to more traditional heroes, of course, like rangers and paladins and stuff. And from a fantasy perspective, there's only a handful of characters that haven't really been explored fully, and one of those archetypes was actually a druid. So Riot have apparently had a lot of interest in creating that druidic type character for quite a long time now. And druids are pretty much always aligned with nature magic, so Ivern definitely fits that bill. When he was first conceived though, he didn't really have that crazy ant-like sort of shape to him. He was actually way more normal, kind of like an ordinary guy. It was only as his character was developed further that he started to grow into a much more unique silhouette. Something that would have been a massive twist on what Ivern is today was that one of the original pitches for this druid character was that instead of being your typical lovable, nature sort of mage type, he would be a really evil and toxic druid, the type of guy that would use his powers to buff up his team and then take all of the powers from his team for himself. And it was a pretty interesting twist on that normal druid archetype, but the initial concept was actually super toxic, so it was scrapped pretty quickly. That alone is actually pretty crazy to think about, and it would have made for an extremely different character than that non-violent sort of druid that Riot ended up going with in the end. However, they did stick with the traditional nature-loving druid values for him in the end, but they decided instead of crafting a more generic druid champion that was kind of just like a cliche ripped out of a tabletop game, they would apply those traditional values to a much more complicated character with a bit of a dark background almost. And it seemed like an awesome way to make the druid archetype a lot more interesting and compelling. So the Green Father concept was created as a way to give that more interesting background to the champion, and it was the narrative writer Riot Faux Shizzle that decided to go with a pretty carefree personality for the druid. One way to make it easy to understand a character is to give them a lot of ambition and kind of like talk about things that they might have to face in the future, like their challenges or their goals that they want to achieve. And for the Green Father, this was actually kind of reversed. So it was designed to be more like learning about the person at the end of the story rather than knowing who someone was before they went through all these, adventures and stuff. The downside to this design is that you don't entirely get to grow with the character like you would, if you're reading about them in like a story or a book, so it was way more important for Riot to make sure that all of his habits and quirks kind of came across the right way in his actual design. So one step for this was to give him a relationship with all the creatures in the jungle, which are reflected a lot in his animations and in his voice lines. It's all about giving subtle clues as to the person he was before he became the Ivern we know today. So if you take a quick look at his design, you can still see the traces of the human he was before, like a little ring hanging on his antler that might have been maybe on his ear before it was transformed into wood. Ivern's concept art shows that additional level of detail really well too. Some of the early concept art when he first started being known as the Green Father showed him as being like a human-like tree almost, kind of like the Ents from Lord of the Rings. Although that was a great starting point for Riot since it combines the idea of humanity with something a lot more natural, it would be really generic and not really help people understand why Ivern became the way he was. The later concept art started to capture more personality rather than showing off just his body shape, and you start to see small little hints that he was originally human, like having a more defined looking human face, or kind of squatting over tending to plants like he was a gardener. The next step did give more of the necessary clues to Ivern's past since it ties in with his former humanity, but it still doesn't entirely tell that much of a story about who Ivern was. The later, more fleshed out sort of concept arts do a much better job here. He might look even more inhuman, but there are still storytelling aspects to his design. For example, him wearing a gauntlet on one arm from his days as an adventurer, hidden by a mushroom but still not fully transformed. The final conceptualization started to paint a clear picture of his personality as well, since he's in a way more animated process that definitely makes you see him as being, energetic and playful, and not really intimidating even though he's still pretty big. Since Riot does like to be super clear with their appearances, giving you like a good idea of what to expect from the champion in the game, this does actually the job quite well since he is meant to be non-violent after all. The next step, of course, was to give him gameplay that fit his personality and appearance, which turns out is actually pretty complicated when having him attack people pretty much goes entirely against his entire concept. So a big part of fixing that issue while keeping the druid theme was to make Ivern a true support jungler, someone that would help his team rather than focus on being offensive himself. Making a pacifist character work in a PvP environment is a pretty massive undertaking, and Riot actually started being completely true to the idea that he didn't want to fight. The original version of Ivern actually dealt 0 damage whatsoever. Like literally in the entire game, throughout a 60-minute game, he would deal 0 points of damage. He didn't have a single effect that could deal any damage. He had a form of crowd control that was kind of like an Elise Cocoon ability, and the rest of his abilities would just give super awesome buffs to his allies, enough so that it still did feel like a 5v5 game rather than a 4v5. It was quickly replaced though, just because even though he wasn't really fighting, he still didn't actually feel like a pacifist almost. He actually kind of felt like this passive-aggressive fist almost, like really unsatisfying to play honestly, because it was kind of, you just bring in your allies to have bodyguard fights for you or something like that. Riot still definitely wanted to find a way to put a 0 damage aspect onto his kit though, which is how of course he developed his unique jungle clear. When Riot develops a jungler, they aim to tick 3 major boxes, giving them mobility, giving them utility for ganks, and the power to clear jungle camps. So the last point, the power to clear jungle camps, is what really stops most champions from actually being able to jungle successfully, since although most champions have a lot of abilities that are great for ganks or really good for team play, they either just can't clear jungle camps reliably, or they just don't have the health to survive against invades or, pull off ganks early in the game using those abilities anyway. So Ivern's free the animals sort of passive effect was made to be a loophole that let him be both a jungling support and to tick that pacifist box on his concept. Being able to clear minions without needing to deal damage means that he can still clear even without having the stats that make him good in a 1v1 fight, and he can still scale and level up normally. By dedicating his entire passive to a jungle clear ability that also makes him work as a pacifist, Riot nailed pretty much all of the necessary parts of his design that needed to be covered, giving them a ton of room to focus on abilities that he could use to help out the rest of his team. So the biggest flaw of the passive was that a magical camp clearing kind of button meant that Ivern would automatically grab buffs and not really be able to share them with his allies with a leash. And since his concept was kind of like the Green Father who wants to share the gifts of nature with other people and stuff like that, it eventually clicked that Ivern really needs to create copies of his buffs so that he could both take it quickly while also not having to worry about sharing the buffs with his team, all at the same time without needing to harm the animals that Ivern loves. And so in the early days of Ivern's design, Riot actually experimented with letting him buff or protect jungle creeps alongside his allies, essentially giving him a way to turn a jungle fight into his favor, or to give him an advantage while being invaded by controlling the jungle minions to be like his own little, servants that fight for him almost. Since his strengths were made to be based around his team play though, Riot opted to actually keep him relatively weak to invades as a way to give opponents a plan of attack, like a counterplay sort of almost, when they're facing Ivern rather than just not being able to do anything against him in the early game and then just falling behind once he starts supporting his team. And since he wasn't going to interact with jungle camps outside of freeing them, this did also open up more spaces on Ivern's kit to show off his, affinity for nature and just his non-violent tendencies. And Riot has mentioned in the past that they have tried adding brushes to a kit to make up for it just kind of lacking things in other areas, but most champions didn't really have a theme that worked well with it. I know they tried it on Caitlyn as well as some other champions in the past, but You can't really get closer than essentially just a nature spirit though. So Riot decided that giving Ivern the brush creation was a really awesome way to demonstrate his whole pacifism almost, while also tying more of his kit into his relationship with nature. Growing brush does add a ton of complexity to the game though, so it was really important that the rest of Ivern's kit worked well around it and that Ivern actually cared about being in the brush in the first place, so that they could justify how complicated of an ability that it was. And of course that's what resulted in Ivern gaining bonus effects when he attacks from the brush itself. It's not perfect since he's not meant to be directly violent, but it does accomplish the feel of what they were going for quite nicely, and he would be pretty useless if he just couldn't defend himself at all in a PvP based environment. So the pacifist angle was only one part of how Riot wanted Ivern to actually feel in game though. The next step was to give him like a little bit of like a trickster kind of vibe almost, which they compared to something like a fairy from Dungeons and Dragons almost, you know, and that came together as making him a support jungler, getting the trickery elements through his like summoning and transforming powers. For example, one of his ultimates actually originally transformed him into the tree called the God Willow, and he just kind of rooted himself down in place and he just couldn't move, and he would just cast a bunch of really powerful abilities and effects in that tree sort of form. It's definitely a demonstration of his affinity for nature and transforming powers, but in terms of gameplay, it was actually quite dull. So Riot headed in the direction of giving him new ways to support, and along with that came a new ultimate version where he would support bruisers, since they're usually kind of stranded in the top lane by themselves. He had one version of his ultimate that would buff up an ally to make them super powerful, and it was like a really powerful ultimate overall actually, kind of like a nano boost effect almost from Ana in Overwatch if you've ever played that. But again, this ability just didn't feel exciting to use at all, because once you used it on an ally, you wouldn't really have anything to do. You'd kind of just like watch them go off on people. And Riot eventually came to the conclusion that if they want Ivern to support a bruiser champion, then they actually need to make it so that he can kind of create his own bruiser to go in and fight for him, which of course led to the development of Daisy. Daisy was made to be like a defensive counterpart to Tibbers almost, like a more defensive version of Tibbers. So essentially just another, you know, friendly AI controlled unit that would shore up Ivern's weaknesses as being like a bad fighter, while also having someone to aid with his support focused kit when he didn't have any other allies around. And unlike Ivern, Daisy's actually definitely a lot more violent, and it actually kind of works though, since it means that it's not really Ivern the one who's being aggressive, it's just Ivern's friend. Turns out figuring out the gameplay for a pacifist champion is really just all about discovering loopholes. Anyway though, that actually is just about going to wrap up everything we know about Ivern and Ivern's development as far as what he could have been goes. The craziest change definitely would have been trying to imagine Ivern as like a twisted evil druid character that wants to buff people and then steal their power for himself. You know, that's a pretty serious 180 from that kind-hearted pacifist character that we know and love today. You know, I'd definitely love to hear what you guys think about Ivern and Riot's design for the druid champion of League of Legends. Personally, I think his design's really cool, although maybe it seems like people aren't entirely enjoying his gameplay just yet, but he is getting some buffs in the future, so who knows, maybe Ivern will be a very competitive pick later on. Either way though, looks like that's gonna be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.